good afternoon, everybody, and good afternoon to those of you who are in the room with us in person, as well as those of you who have joined us online. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ellen MacKenzie. I'm the Dean of the Bloomberg School, and I'm just thrilled to be with you here today to celebrate the release of this important new book. I just told Vanya I very rarely have props, so this is great. This is a great prop. This collection of essays, as many of you know, features experts from across Johns Hopkins, and we are incredibly fortunate to have many of them here with us today to talk about our common goal of building a nurturing and effective educational system needed ever so much. And of course, we're having this discussion at, dare I say, a difficult time, very uncertain times, as many of us are grappling with how to advance our goals for public health and education under a new presidential administration. As we look to the future, the health and well-being of our nation's children is at the forefront of our minds. There is hard work ahead, we know that. But there's also great promise at the intersection of education and public health. And it's vital that we focus on both the challenges, but also the opportunities that are before us. And this book gives us a great place to start. And I'm sure, as many of you know, it was edited by three amazing individuals. First, Chris Morphew, who is the dean, yes? Who is the dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Education. Vanya Jones. She is, who is a professor and assistant dean for community engaged research at the Bloomberg School, and Ashley Curtin, who is an assistant professor of social work and educational studies at the University of Michigan. They have brought together a powerful selection of essays written by researchers who understand both the importance of educational leadership and the potential for upstream solutions, which is so important. When we talk about school safety, people often think first and foremost about violence prevention, which is top of mind. But this book is about so much more. As Chris writes in his introduction, safe schools are those that are free of every sort of risk a student might experience, not just violence. And this book highlights the collaborative work that is happening in Baltimore and across the country. It provides concrete examples of effective programs, tools, and policies, everything from suicide prevention to restorative practices to trauma-informed approaches. And importantly, this book reminds us that schools are a venue where public health solutions are crucial, not just for the students who are in those schools, but for the adults who work there, for families and parents, for the entire community. When we create healthier schools, we are also creating a healthier world. The possibilities before us are tremendous, and I'm excited for the chance to dive into a topic that is so close to our hearts and key to our shared future. I hope today you will come away with not only new ideas, but a renewed commitment to all we can do for our schools and our students and their families. In a time of upheaval and change, your work in this space is more urgent than ever. Thank you again to our panelists for being here and to everyone who joined us both here in person as well as online to listen and to learn. And of course, I'm delighted to be joined today by my dear friend, colleague, and fellow dean, Chris Morphew. So Chris, I'll invite you to come up and say a few words.
Thank you, Ellen. I've enjoyed working over the last 8 years with Ellen. She and I began our deanships within 6 weeks of each other, Ellen? And I'm sorry for us, but happy for you that you'll be returning to the faculty here at Bloomberg and continuing your work here. And I'm sure that's going to be some great opportunities for you as well as for the Bloomberg School. So I want to thank everyone who found time to attend either in person or online today. I really appreciate you showing up at the late afternoon for what I think is going to be a great session with a lot of incredible information and presenters. I want to thank Dean MacKenzie for hosting us here in this beautiful space in the Bloomberg building. Just as a point of reference, our building will be opening up in about a year. And you'll all be welcome. We'll host you at our event, at an event in our building very, very soon. We're excited about that. And I want to recognize, first of all, my partner in crime here, Vanya Jones. There she is. I got my reading glasses on so I can get a pan across here. This project has been I was going to say a labor of love, but more like a labor of fun. We've enjoyed ourselves throughout, sometimes perhaps at the cost of timeliness in producing things, but we had a good time. And I think you're going to hear from panelists today who participated in some of that fun and contributed to some of that fun. I also want to thank Ashley Curitan, who's online and I think in Taiwan at the moment, 13 hours ahead of us as our co-partner here in crime, and Ashley Graham, who's sitting right over here, who has ably assisted us throughout things and gotten all the work done. As Dean MacKenzie was just saying, this is a collaborative. This is a collaborative book, and it exhibits, I think, it illustrates very clearly what President Daniels talks about when he talks about one university moments. This was an opportunity to get a number of experts from the School of Education, the School of Public Health together to bring their collective expertise and breadth to look at a really complex problem. How do we make schools safer, healthier places? And that problem is even more complex because so much of the oxygen in the room and the oxygen in the debates around safe schools is taken up with crazy things around school safety instead of thinking about making schools safe and healthier places. So bulletproof backpacks and lunch pails and things like that. When in fact we know from some of the research you're going to be hearing about today and some of the researchers you're going to be hearing from that making schools safer, healthier places can actually be done by thinking about things like mental health, thinking about things like trusted adults, and thinking about the ways we incorporate safety to make sure that it's equitable in how it's implemented. So I want to thank everybody who contributed to the book. Again, this was a very fun project for me to participate in. Thank the JHU Press, which published the book, Greg Britton at the press, Ezra and Hillary, who participated with us on working us through all that process, which everyone who's written a book before knows can be long and tedious. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Vanya, and she's going to take you through and introduce you to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, there's so many people in the room. Thank you all for joining. My back has been, for those of you online, my back has been to the room, so this is great. I want to start out by thanking Dean MacKenzie and Dean Morphew, both who are inspirational leaders and remind us how important education is across the life course spectrum. I also want to echo some advice that I was given by my mentor, Dr. Andrea Gielen, when I started out my PhD. She told me to find people you enjoy working with. And hopefully on this panel of different authors that come up, you'll see how much we enjoyed working together to bring this book to fruition. So without further ado, I'm going to start by bringing up the first panelist, Dr. Holly Wilcox. And we're going to talk a little bit about Holly's chapter. Hi, Holly. Come join me. So, I know I'm supposed to talk in the microphone. So your chapter focuses on mental health in youth. Can you tell us a little bit about the trends and epidemiology of adolescent mental health?
Thanks for that question, and thanks for having me. Mental health has become one of the defining public health challenges that we face today. And so the rates of suicide among young people have been generally increasing over 20 years. In terms of the epidemiology of suicide, what we've been seeing are youth of color, with very rapidly increasing rates. Youth living in rural settings, also we've been seeing higher rates of depression. The general rule of thumb is that in any classroom, between 1 of 5 young people has been or will struggle within a year with a mental health problem. And so rates of anxiety and depression have been increasing, and suicide has generally been increasing also, with suicidal thoughts and attempts, according to our surveillance data.
I think one of the things that you talk about in your book really brings us home to think about what are some things that schools are doing in order to support youth mental health. Can you talk a little bit about what schools are doing?
Thank you, Vanya. And it's been challenging, given that we're in the circumstances that we're in, it's really hard for schools to ignore the crisis that we're facing with youth mental health. And so the doors have been opening, from, so to speak, for schools to address this issue. And so, one approach, we're in a school of public health, and of course we think about what we can do universally to help young people. And one opportunity that we have is to try to embed some standard skills and curricula within the health education curriculum. And so, we can use health education, which is required in most states at a young age, middle school and older. And so we can think about what skills we would want our young people to learn. And like Dean Morphew was saying, when to go to a trusted adult. Oftentimes there are these codes of secrecy that kids have. I want to die by suicide, but don't tell anybody. And, so letting kids know how to support a friend in crisis. And by learning about how to support a friend in crisis, they'll learn how to support themselves. And so when to go to a trusted adult, when to know when something's a crisis and they have to take action. And so these are all skills that are pretty easy to teach young people. So for the most part, that's it. And schools have been more receptive to learning about this. And the other thing I want to say about this issue is we worry about school culture and climate a lot, and school culture and climate is so important. And by embedding some of these programs into the school day, really, we hope that it will destigmatize mental health problems, enable students who need help to get help, and also give them the opportunity in a naturalized setting to know that there are people that care about them, and that hopefully it will help improve the culture and climate of the setting.
Yeah, I appreciate you talking about the stuff that schools are currently doing. Is there something that you recommend them dig deeper into, pay more attention to, put more emphasis on? What would be some of the things that you think are the practical implications from your chapter that we can keep moving forward?
Yes, I do think that we have to think about using health education. The other thing is, I think that, school leaders ideally will model wellness and support mental health and be out, kind of open about their support for student mental health and well-being. And by them modeling that behavior, we hope that it will trickle down to help students. So, the thinking about using school systems to make them supportive and safe places, I think the norms. We have to shift the norms within school buildings to be more supportive and generally mental health friendly. And that is, I think, one thing I'm taking away from our book that is emphasized across chapters.
I hope everyone is listening and taking note of the amazing work that Dr. Wilcox has done. I also we're moving quickly through our conversation to get to the next panel. And in that, I want to ask you, what's the big takeaway from your chapter? This is a question I'm going to ask every panel. So I want them to fine tune for you what they want you to take away from their chapter. So
well, one thing I would want schools to know is that actually by impacting mental health, by focusing on mental health, it will improve academics. because students who are struggling with mental health may have difficulty learning. And so there are a number of studies that have come out, and the evidence is really emerging that by addressing proactively mental health in school settings, it will improve multiple outcomes, including the goals of most schools are really academic related outcomes. And so I think that is one takeaway that I think is really important to emphasize, that there is this trickle-down impact for multiple outcomes, including academic achievement.
So if you take nothing else away, take away if you help mental health, you help academic achievement. Dr. Wilcox, thank you so much. Thank you. And I'm going to move in for the next panel. Dr. Beth Marshall and Dr. Terry Powell. So this is a panel that's going to be a little more of a conversation with two people. And I'm going to start the questions. I heard your chapter is based on a class that you teach at Hopkins. Shout out to classes at Hopkins, just so you know.
Yes, third term.
Can you tell me a little bit about the class?
Yes. So Dr. Powell and I have been teaching this class together for about the last decade, and I do want to shout out our other author, Asari Afyang, who is not with us today, but she was a doctoral student in our department and the TA for our class, and so she is also an author on the chapter. So the class is called Asset-Based Approaches to Vulnerable Youth. And like the chapter, we spend a good bit of time in the class introducing students to asset-based approaches to research and programming for youth. And one of the asset-based approaches that we cover in the chapter and that we cover in the class is positive youth development. And positive youth development has this tagline that problem-free is not fully prepared is not fully engaged. And when we think about that from education, we can think about it like problem-free. We're thinking about dropout prevention. So great, we get to 12th grade, you've graduated. Are you prepared and engaged and ready to be a productive and thriving member of society? So there's a lot of great asset-based approaches like critical youth engagement, resiliency, trauma-informed approaches, and they all share the same perspective, which is that it's strengths-based and person-centered. And so that asset-based approach recognizes that people have resources that they can bring to the table, and that they can and they should be engaged and have voice and choice in their growth and development, particularly young people. And often adult attitudes tend to jump in the way of young people having that.
Anything you'd like to add, Dr. Powell?
No, we've practiced this.
Oh, fantastic. This is scripted, people. This is scripted. So in public health, we are accustomed to talking about prevention. Who am I addressing this to?
Me.
All right. How do prevention and assets-based approaches work together?
Great question that I had no clue you were going to ask.
No clue, I'm sure.
Right. So often we think about preventing something negative, right? So reducing the likelihood of a negative outcome. So often students are like, oh, well, how does asset-based or strengths fit with preventing negative? Well, we think about it as prevention being a point in time, right? So when do we want to intervene? We want to before something happens, while, or with a targeted population. And an asset-based approach, those are things we think about how, right? So they're not mutually exclusive. We can think about how to do something at any time point. So for example, if we're thinking about safe and healthy schools, if one of the things we want to do is prevent chronic absenteeism, like nobody wants the kids to be gone all the time, right? Great, wonderful. We can do that and think about how we do that. One way could be like, all right, we're gonna penalize them if they're absent. Alternatively, we could ask hey, why aren't you at school and what can we do to help you, right? How can you help your peers come to school more frequently. So involving them, again, with these ideas of voice and choice and involving young people in the solutions process. And so when we're talking to our students in this class and even in this chapter, we're saying, like, we don't see this as an opposing force to prevention. Like, we have to start somewhere, right? Often we start where the gaps are. And so one way to do that is to, yes, figure out where you want to start and then use an asset-based approach to determine how you want to proceed from there.
I have so many follow-up questions, but I know we have a script that we have to keep to, so I'm going to keep going. I need to take the class more on the story.
Or read the chapter.
I have done that many times, but I do have more discussion points, Terry. More discussion
We
points.
would love you on Monday nights.
Oh, thank you. So, what makes asset-based approaches particularly important for schools? I'm assuming I'm going this way. This way. All right.
So, first, like, young people spend so much time in schools, right? It's the majority of their waking hours. So we want it to be an environment that is really focused on strengthening their growth and development in a positive way. So in the chapter, there are 8 components that are pretty common across all the asset-based approaches, and I'm not going to go into each of the components, but there are a couple that I think are really important when it comes to schools. One is focusing on personal relationships. All asset-based approaches focus on personal relationships. And when we think about schools and we think about, as a parent, think about the education that I want for my young people, I want them to have personal relationships in school. I want them to be connected to their teachers, to their peers. They also invite meaningful contribution from young people, and they acknowledge that meaningful contribution. At the same time, they're attending to the systems and contexts that young people are operating in outside of the school building. And when we think about these components together, they create approaches that really invite teachers to focus on the strengths of those students and to engage them in ways, like Dr. Powell said, that give them the voice and the choice in their learning environments. And often when we have young people who are coming from stressed communities, who are somehow marginalized by society, we often have them come into schools and we label them as problematic or deficient in some way, as opposed to seeing the strengths that they're bringing into our classrooms. So the ideal of schools, right, is that we have environments where everyone is succeeding. And we know that we haven't always gotten there, but we think that to do that, it's really about centering young people and inviting those relationships while paying attention to the pieces that are outside of the school building that they bring in with them.
So that leads us to ask the next question, naturally, which is, what are some challenges to implementing the assets-based approaches?
Right. I mean, because it's a lot.
Yes.
It's a lot. It's like the multi-level model. It's like all of the pieces.
Right. If it was easy, everybody would
do
do it. Right.
There you go. Right. And so it's true. And honestly, though, we whittled it down to 3 main challenges that are not unique to the asset-based approaches, but really, as we think about what we're asking of people, time, money, and consistency. Time, right? People in the school building are asked to do all of the things, right? They are asked to be teachers, coaches, mental health professionals sometimes, talk with parents, keep up with their content area, all of the things, like tap dance, all of it, right? And so I think that we know that our hours are finite. There's only so much time in the day to be able to do all the things. And so when one's prioritizing the list of things, perhaps our school officials or school personnel are like, okay, we can't also ask kids. Like, that's going to take us 3 more days to do, and the deadline was last week, right? And so we recognize that time might be one of the challenges for using some of these asset-based approaches, because it takes time to build good, long friendships or partnerships, and not everybody has that amount of time. And to even build trust. And so the second one is money. Like, people say money doesn't buy happiness, but it buys a lot of books. It buys a lot. It buys a lot of training, right? Like, it buys a lot of things. And so, like, I think that to think that we can do this work without being funded well, and making sure that the people who are working in these spaces are funded, or that the programs have the adequate funding, especially some of the evidence-based ones that we know already work well. We need to make sure that they're properly funded. And then last is consistency. Because it's easy to, we live in a world, sometimes we do things in 5-year stints, right? Or we give up at the first sign of success or failure. And so sometimes it's important to work past all of those things and keep going, right? To keep going for the next group of students, because I think students are always watching us, right? They're watching us. They are seeing how we move through the world, like when we stop, when we quit, when we decide to not invest. And so like the idea of like building relationships over time, having students come back. We mentioned our student Sara. She's graduated 3 years since now, and we still are in contact because that was important for us to make sure she was a part of this chapter.
So what makes it still worth it, knowing all these challenges, Dr. Marshall?
I think at a base level, like young people deserve this, right? They have the right to be engaged in their learning environments. But also there's research that shows that these approaches are effective, and even sometimes more effective than when we're focusing on deficit models. Asset-based approaches build all different types of skills, right? Skills at resolving conflicts, skills raising self-awareness, and it makes our classrooms more inclusive as we're bringing in diverse sets of skills that our students can bring, that their families can bring, that the communities can bring. And like, they want this. Young people consistently want to have a voice in things, and they are spending so much time in schools, they deserve it.
Well, with that, I'm going to ask the last question that I promised the audience I'd ask everyone. What's the takeaway from your chapter?
I'll be quick because I know we're running out of time. The one takeaway is that you can do it, right? Like wherever you are on your journey, you can do it, right? You can use a part or a piece of or all of an asset-based approach to work with young people in your schools. In the chapter and in the class, we talk about each of the approaches, and then we often bring in speakers from programs who've also done it. And so in the chapter, we highlight some of those programs as well. And so like that would be the takeaway. You can do it. Start where you are and go from there.
You have anything to add?
The only thing I would add is that, like Dr. Powell said, like they're all a little different. You don't have to hit every component, but it really does start with this mind shift to putting students at the center.
Thank you. Thank you. I will bring up the next panelist, Dr. Richard Lofton. Now I have a question for you, and I want you to, I don't know if you need to read the book and I can open it, but I'm going to ask.
Okay, can we be unscripted?
We could be unscripted, but I have to ask about the title of your book chapter and how it comes about in the work that you do. Do you need me to read the title? Do you want to tell everybody in the room?
Yeah, let's read the title so everyone would know the title.
So Richard Lofton's chapter is chapter 5 for those of you who are following along at home, and it's called The Mundane Terror Black Students Experience in Their Schools and Communities. That's a mouthful, and I would like Dr. Lofton to unpack it for us.
Thank you, and I'm actually really excited to be here and be sitting next to you. I value this woman right here. She's gonna be mad at me for saying this, but because of her, I continue to work at Hopkins and do a lot of good stuff. And she deserves an applause because many people don't know, but we have a really strong relationship and she's amazing, so thank you.
Okay, so about that title, let's go back to that title. Let's talk about it.
And it goes into, moving along, mundane terror. There's 2 things I want you to know about my research. The first thing is I think we have spent too much time looking at equity through test scores. Where did we get that from? Who told us to make that association, right? When you think about, the human basic needs, Maslow, even before Coleman, talked about safety, belonging, right? Water, food, sleep, right? The public health things. But yet we have associated equity with test scores. So for me, there's a gap that we must address. And that is really trying to get to the human basic needs. And you know, most of my research, we look at school infrastructure. We look at the lack of water in our schools, right? We look at transportation. We look at belonging and safety. Those are the issues that we really need to get at. And our students are fighting just to survive in these environments. And what I call and what I'm trying to get at is this mundane terror, this everyday struggle that our students have to encounter because we have reneged on our promise of a thorough and efficient education. They have not reneged on their promise, right? They come to school. Now, transportation is a problem, so it's going to be harder for them to get to school. Food insecurity is a problem, so they're going to be harder for them to get to school and their family to support them to get to school. And, you know, they got to take care of grandma because of the issues that she's had, right? So I think we need to do a step back and think about human needs. But in order to understand that, you must address them as human. And I think a lot of the problem is that we haven't really humanized Black students. My second point is that we have to move away from the economy that we're in. I really don't believe we ever moved away from a plantation economy. I think we need to move further away from it, right? Slavery, Jim Crow, then this racial quarantine that took place that caused many people to lose their lives in the early 1900s, that we don't talk about with race riots, right? You think that's a long time ago. No, my great-grandmother was born during that time and lived during that time, right? And so a lot of the work that we're doing, we're focusing and we're doing some of the same things over and over again. But I'm calling us to think of things in new ways. If we want healthy and safe schools, let's make sure we humanize our students. Make sure they have food, make sure they have water, make sure they have school environments where they can learn, right? That's where we need to go. And so because we're not providing that and we're reneging on our promise, our students every single day in Baltimore, according to them, are trying to survive and do the work that us adults have failed to do. And what I have labeled that, and I'm invoking Sadir Hartman, is mundane terror, the everyday struggles. It's not the big violent things that occur, but what happens on the bus when you get up in the morning and you get sexually harassed, right? And then after being sexually harassed, you get off the bus and you get someone yelling at you because you're late. But people don't know they're late because the buses are overcrowded and it takes a long time for them to get to school. And the reason that they're a long time to get to school because they're trying to get to the best schools, but the best schools are sometimes not in their neighborhood.
So can I pause for a second? Because you're jumping into information that you share in the book chapter. And it's
sorry
specific.
about that.
No,
You gotta
I think
read it.
it's
You gotta
it's
read
great.
it.
You gotta read it. But it's specific to Baltimore. Some of the context that you're talking about is specific to Baltimore. And you give narratives from youth in Baltimore. And so as you're talking about the work that you do, that's in our hometown here in Baltimore.
Yes.
Can you talk through sort of what grounds your research with these young people when you talk about transportation and you talk about the building and you talk about access? Give us some guidance on what helps to ground your research.
Yeah, as a postdoc, I left Columbia, came directly here to Hopkins. And as the same year that I actually got here, we had the Freddie Gray situation. And I was just shocked, right? I come from a middle class, working class background right outside of Los Angeles. And I thought I knew everything about urban areas. I was shocked. I didn't know anything. And what I learned with my Ivy League education actually took me further away, right? And so I had to take it upon myself to go into communities and actually figure out what was going on. And so I had the opportunity to actually meet people and talk to people. And I talked to over 50 young people about their experiences. And one of the main things that they talked about is that no one is asking us about what we are experiencing. Everyone is telling us what we need to do, right? And so from that finding, I said, I want to do something. And I decided the Nobody Asked Me campaign. And I've been working with colleagues and friends and people who've been dedicated to really improving the lives of young people. And actually, you are one of them. And it takes a village to do this work. And remember, we're all fighting the plantation economy, regardless of who you are, right? And once we understand that, you're my sister and you can never be my enemy, right? But we'll have it in a way that we're competing. In no way are we, because there's something bigger and deeper going on. And so we have to support each other, particularly in this time. This is a very serious time. And I say that because I spend so much time in schools as well as in communities. And our young people are really hurting. And so from that 50, we then went on and did 180. From then, we also did 45 teachers and administrators. So we did students and parents. I think it was like 180 interviews. And then we moved on to teachers, administrators, and I think it's like 45 right now. But we're still in schools now because we've talked to young people and their parents, but we understood because of the political economy that we're in, we're not talking to the administrators and the teachers as well. And so once we understand where we all are and we're not each other's enemy, I'm hoping that we can have a collective win in this struggle.
So we've reached our last question, and it's the one that everyone's getting asked. What do you want people to take away from your chapter in this book?
To humanize.
Say more.
I want us to humanize people. I want us to love people. I want us to support each other. I want us to understand and have passion and empathy for that little girl that have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get on a bus and have to deal with that public transportation, as well as the teacher who's in the classroom who's working extremely hard as well. And so I think once we get away from this way of thinking that only focus on test scores, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the byproduct. But first it has to be meeting the basic human needs, safety, belonging, and then next is cognition and achievement. We cannot stop at the top, we have to stop at the bottom. And that's what I want people to understand with the work that I'm doing.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you for being amazing.
And we'll bring up the last two panelists. Dr. Megan Collins and Dr. Sara Johnson. You've been a great audience, by the way. You're like super enthusiastic and great smiles. And I'm sure online you're bringing it into you, so thank you. So I'm going to start with the first question. And I don't know. Okay, Dr. Collins, I was pointed to you. Why did you write this chapter? It's supposed to be green. Okay, yes.
Green is good.
Green is good.
Hello, everybody. Again, thank you, Dr. Jones, Dr. Morphew, Dr. Curitan, who's not here right now. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I want you to all close your eyes for a minute, because it's probably good to do that in these times, but also think back to March 13th, 2020.
People, we've been through some hard times before, haven't we?
5 years, but I have been friends with Dr. Jones for 5 years because of it. So March 13th, 2020, for those who may not remember that day, largely schools across the United States closed. And one of my colleagues, Ann Curie, is in the audience, who works with me on the Vision for Baltimore program. And this is a program where we bring eye care directly into Baltimore City schools. And I have to say, a lot of us working in the program just cried that day. We're like, what's going to happen to kids and the health services that they're getting in schools when schools close? And that was really part of the impetus that brought together a lot of us with that shared vision at Hopkins. Dr. Johnson, of course, who's done so much work with the Rails Health Center. Several of our co-authors who are not here, and a few who are here, including Dr. Marshall, and Alan Regenberg, I think, is in the audience or online, and Dr. Faden from the Berman Institute of Bioethics, and Andrew Nicklin and Dr. Annette Anderson from the School of Education. Am I forgetting any authors? Okay, I hope not. But all of us had been working in the space of well-being of children and the nexus of health and education, and thinking about how do we support kids. And all of a sudden this pandemic came. And all of the work and all of the infrastructure and all of the relationships going into schools, talking to kids, talking to teachers, understanding what they need and how to support them, all of it came to a screeching halt. And so we brought a group of individuals together, and I think a university like Hopkins is so exceptional in this way, in that you have faculty in education and public health and bioethics and medicine who all care about this and want to work together. And we came together collectively to start talking about these issues together and trying to provide guidance. At that point in time, there's so much misinformation, so much confusion. Should schools open? Should they close? Should we wear masks? Should we not wear masks? When will a vaccine come out? What will happen in my school? What will happen in my school that doesn't have the resources or safe water? Can we distance desks apart and things like that? And so we came together and started thinking, well, what should we do about this? And it came with, let's do reopening checklists. Let's do white papers. Let's do dashboards. Let's visualize what we know and try to get that information out there. And it was getting the data, visualizing it, having transparency, which I think hopefully catalyzed some accountability by school districts and programs to start thinking about some of these issues they may not have been thinking about. And the chapter really sort of summarizes a labor of love of what we spent several years working very hard together to bring about, and hopefully, hopefully it will, as you're going to probably get into with the next question.
Well, we can go to the next question, as
Where-
you prompt me to do my job, Dr. Collins.
So I was just going to keep rambling.
That's okay. Her rambling is great. Isn't her rambling great? What has changed since writing this chapter?
Well, fortunately, we're not in the depths of COVID, so shout out for that. I think one of the things that became really obvious through some of the work that was part of the tracker and other work from folks at the School of Public Health and elsewhere is the huge priority on understanding and using data to identify variation in the resources that were provided both within specific districts and across. So understanding equity and inequity issues, this pandemic really laid that plain. So I think that's part of it. But I think there are real opportunities that came out of both this project and of the pandemic, and some of them are a greater appreciation of the role of the whole child and bringing the whole child into schools, right? We used to think about test scores, as Dr. Lofton was sharing, as sort of the center and the key barometer of how kids were doing. And then we understand that what is happening to kids outside of schools is so critical to who they are in schools, and that not only do we need to recognize that in the form of mental health challenges or behavioral challenges that Dr. Wilcox talked about, but we also need to appreciate all of the resources and services that are being provided as part of schools, and that those are not ancillary, but they're sort of part of the DNA of the learning environment, and that's how we address these assets and skills that kids need to be healthy and thrive, not just great teaching. So I think those are the big takeaways from that time.
Yeah, I think your chapter really puts out there all that schools do for youth and families. I think if it's the last chapter in the book, it focuses on the COVID experience and what COVID taught us about the infrastructure of schools for young people and their families. And I'm leading up to the next question, and I'm assuming you're doing the same thing Dr. Marshall and Powell did, that I'm going back and
Learn
forth,
from the best.
which is, what do you want people to take away? I know I said that was going to be the last question, but this was their next question, which is, what's important in this chapter that you want people to think about?
Everything.
Everything. It's good. Everything.
No, I think I would just follow up on some of the points that Dr. Johnson just made. And it's I think we often have this assumption that schools is where we go to learn, and kids come in fed and dressed and mentally prepared, and they're a blank slate, and we teach them like we teach them in this auditorium here, and everybody's paying attention, and then they go home and they do their homework and they have a healthy dinner, they brush their teeth, and they go to bed. The reality is many of our children live in vastly complex settings, and many of those fundamental needs, rights of human life are not being met, and they impact how they do during the school day. And there's been a huge sort of shift in growth and scope over the years of teachers. You talk to any elementary, middle, high school teacher, they will tell you, they're an educator, they are a therapist, they are a kind of jack of all trades of sewing uniforms together at times. They're doing so many different things for kids during the school day. And when something like a pandemic happens, all of those support systems that we have built an ecosystem in schools to help with falls apart. So first, I think we recognize how important and central schools are to that. But second is when things disrupt schools, all of those other pieces kind of cascade downwards. So what are the supports that we need to be given to our teachers, to our schools? What are the resources that we need to have in our communities so that if there are future disruptions in education and future pandemics, and hopefully all of the brilliant people of the School of Public Health will prevent those from happening, but if they do, what do we need to do? What have we learned, and how can we move forward? And I think, today is a perfect example of, we brought together an audience that I imagine is so diverse in terms of backgrounds, interests, what brought you here today, what chapter resonated with you the most. And our backgrounds and training are also different, but we've all come together collectively with sort of a shared mission and an interest in helping the well-being and life course of children, and that you can bring together faculty from an exemplary university, and you can use data, and you can advocate for best practices, and you can make change. And I think we did help increase accountability. I think we did help make change, and I think we did help conversations that are hopefully still happening today and will continue well into the next decade.
So we're going to end on a question with you that's a little different. We had what was the takeaway from the chapter question already. I'm going to end with, what do you both want people to do? What is the thing that you think is important for people to do when it comes to young people in schools and education?
I would say that I think the most important thing we can do is understand and give the same grace to kids that we give to ourselves, which is that we need to invest in the whole child, in the entire person, and their health and well-being outside of the classroom and inside of the classroom in order to expect them to perform and to learn. And so we are willing to give ourselves that kind of grace and make those kinds of investments, but health is such an integral part of schools that I think that's really our main focus of what should people do. They should understand the close relationship between health and schools.
So you didn't know I was going to do this, but we're moving into the Q&A session, and there are 2 chairs, and there are 2 people already sitting in the chairs. This does not preclude the other panelists from being asked questions. But we're going to move into the question portion, and I'm going to just have you stay here with me. Is that okay? Is that okay?
I was trying to run.
I know you were. That's
but
why I
I
said it in front of a group of witnesses.
I didn't
That's
get
what
to
was
answer
happening.
the question, though. I
Oh,
was going to
yes.
say everybody should get their vision tested.
Dr. Collins, would you like to tell the room what your specialty is so they know why?
I'm a pediatric ophthalmologist, but my focus is on delivery of eye care to children within the school setting and building community connections.
So if it hasn't drawn home that there are many experts in different disciplines contributing to this book, I hope what Dr. Collins does helps bring that home for you. So we're going to open it to the question and answer portion. We have an audience of people here in person, and we have a mic. So please raise your hand, ask a question. There is one online, and I'm wondering who's going to take this. I know there are other authors also in the room, so this might be a question to other authors. Cindy asks, so Cindy's online. There's been a lot of talk lately about social media's influence on young people. Can you talk about the influence of youth mental health and education? And then if you have any policy recommendations, Cindy, you're asking the hard questions. Also, just to make it even more complex, anybody want to talk about that TikTok ban after all? That's Cindy's question. Who would like to have that conversation? Do we have a social media youth expert in the room? I think Holly is the person who's, yes.
I turned it on for you.
Thank you. There's not a lot of conclusive evidence right now on the impact of social media on mental health. The one thing that the evidence base is pointing to is that there's a subgroup of young people who are very negatively impacted by social comparison and other things that can happen as a result of social media. And in terms of policy recommendations, a lot of schools now are having students put away their phones or they're storing phones during the day. So that is one recommendation that some schools are following now for a number of reasons to limit social media and other use of the phone and to keep the attention while in the building on coursework and not on all the other things happening in the world. So I think I'll stop there and maybe give someone else a chance to answer or give their thoughts on this issue.
Just where I'm circling the folks. Dean Morphew, you have any comments? Anything you'd like to add? I think she covered it well. Other questions? Any other questions or comments for the authors or in the room?
Can I ask a question
Yes,
of the authors?
of course you can.
I would like to know from Drs. Powell and Marshall, how have your conversations with teachers and school leaders gone about asset-based approaches? And how do you have those conversations? Because it seems like intuitively very appealing, but also, as you already mentioned, like a lift. So how have you engaged educators in those conversations?
I just turned the microphone off. So I think, some of the organizations that we've worked with and that we've had come into the class and that are held up in the chapter are both within schools and, schools are great because there are extracurricular activities and after school hours, and all of these are an opportunity to sort of center those asset-based approaches. So, I think that for the most part, people who work with young people every day see the strengths of young people. And so I think that for the most part, folks are on board. Like one of the examples in the chapter is the restorative practices pilot in Baltimore City schools. And so restorative practices is an asset-based approach. It can be challenging to implement school-wide, as folks who, and Dr. Johnson, who's worked with schools, have seen. But when schools have committed to it and gotten everyone in the building on board, they've seen really great outcomes from using these type of practices in schools.
Yeah, and I think too, both Dr. Marshall and I have done a lot of community engaged work. And so a lot of that just starts with listening, because you'd be surprised that how much schools are already doing. And so rather than like pull our, our Rolodex out of like, well, that's an asset-based approach, I think we just lean into what they're already doing. They're like, oh yeah, we got this thing. We're like, oh my gosh, that's a great way that you're involving young people. Have you tried it in this setting? Or, oh, like you're doing that with the middle schoolers. Oh, I wonder what it'll look like for your elementary school. So I think that, like listening to what's already happening and like giving school personnel like just like a little bit of praise for the pieces they're already doing has at least helped us like think about like, oh, okay, they feel a little bit more empowered, like, oh my gosh, you saw that, I didn't think anybody would ever see it. So that's also helpful, like not necessarily calling it positive youth development, but like us hearing like the things that they're doing are that, and then encouraging them to do more of that has been helpful.
Things I learned from Parenting 101.
We have a hand in the room. We're trying to make sure everybody hears you. We want to make sure everybody, even those online, get to hear you.
Fair enough. This question is for Dr. Lofton, but other people may have responses or similar experiences. But you were sharing that you've spoken to 180 parents and students, and then 45 faculty, administrators, staff. Are they talking the same language, or is one group referring to a set of challenges or opportunities, and the other group is somewhat oblivious or talking about an entirely different set of challenges that they're facing? Is there a disconnect? Is there similarity and overlap?
So there's a lot of disconnects and there's a lot of similarities as well. And I think that's an amazing question. From teachers, right, administrators, it's the parent fault. Parents are not doing what they need to do. And that's why children are late. That's why children are not doing well, right? Then we get parents. It's, the teacher fault. It's the administrator fault. And it goes back to what I'm trying to say. When you have policies that do not humanize people, that other person buys into that, right? And think that they're the problem. And that's why I want us to move away from how we're thinking about education, because we're playing the same game and getting the same results that Coleman got, 60 years ago. Why are we doing that, right? So let's make sure that we understand their human needs. We want to make sure that we have great teachers, wonderful teachers. What do we need to do that? What do we need to do in order for that to come about? But also we want to make sure that students feel comfortable and also safe in their school. And I think once we are able to really humanize people who are already human, right, I think we could get back on that track and have collective wins.
I want to point out that Aaron online also asked Dr. Lofton to comment on the impact of mundane terror on school staff. And I think you just did that. I think you just gave us a really good snapshot of the work you're doing and how it shows up for staff.
Well, I'm really concerned from the superintendent who has to deal with, and this is in every school district, right? This focus on standardized test scores and trying to dehumanate who that person is. And if you really look at our news, you'll see top leaders always having to assert their humanity and what they're doing. And they're not taking money and they're not doing crazy stuff, right? So we have this narrative of only looking at urban school districts in a way that is very negative. And so we got to release that way of thinking and actually allow school superintendents to do the work that they are supposed to do and that they're trained to do, and moving beyond just standards and accountability. That's one thing. But it's trickled down to teachers and principals. And now they, because of the whole push on standards, accountability, cannot do the work of assets in many ways because they're focused on they have to teach in a certain way. So our system, we really need to change and take a step back and look at how we can change the system. We need some strong people to talk in strong ways right now too. This is not the time to be scared. This is the time to get loud, and collectively seeing what is the problem and how we can overcome it.
I think we are officially at time with that comment. We hit, it's 5:01. I do want to take a minute that I appreciate Dr. Lofton's final statement, which is this is the time for us to show up and not shrink who we are. I am thankful for all the people who contributed to this book. I said earlier that I am echoing the sentiments of my mentor. Work with people who you enjoy to work with. And if you didn't pick up on the camaraderie of what was going on the stage, where were you? What were you doing? Were you multitasking? Because I picked up on it. I want to thank Chris Morphew. I didn't get a moment to thank Chris. The moral of the story is I become a co-editor of this book one day because Dean Morphew picked up the phone and said, Vanya, I think we should write a book together and I think we should focus on mental health and have a public health lens. And we get here because you decided to reach across the school, call me and bring me in much earlier in my career. And I thank you for that. And I hope that we get to do this for more future groups. And I hope that this is just one book of many opportunities between our two schools because the importance of building youth health, schools, and what it means to be solid public health and in our infrastructure is really important. Thank you. Thank you. And for those of you who are online, I hope you have a good rest of your day.